Our next presenter is Dr. Kathleen Colvin, and Dr. Colvin is a clinical psychologist. She practices in Newport Beach, where she offers specialized services and workshops for creative and performing artists. Before her training in psychology, Kathleen was mentored in opera productions by Beverly Sills, and they maintained a lifelong friendship until Beverly's death in 2007. So today we have the joy of having Kathleen present on Beverly Sills, A Lifetime of Resilience with Music as the Medicine That Heals. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody. This is actually a wonderful memory for me. So if I go into a dreamlight state or a trance up here, you'll just realize that I'm going back 40-some years to when I actually, by the example of my wonderful mentor, Beverly Sills, I figured out this actual intervention called Art Can Heal Your Life. It's not actually art therapy. It's actually working through your form of art, whether you're an opera singer, a pianist, whether you are a potter, whether you're a painter, figuring out how to use these tools that are integral to you and your personality to actually heal yourself when you get blocked. So we're using these ideas, and I want to thank, we just were talking about Carol Rosenberger. We talked about her 2 years ago, and thank Jacqueline and Barry for having me back again to talk about Art Can Heal Your Life. Beverly wrote several books. I'll be using excerpts from her autobiography today to read in her own words how she actually healed and cured herself so that she could come back to opera again after having horrible and devastating experiences in her family. And also, of course, we have to hear the music, so we'll be using the CD from The Art of Beverly Sills. Fortunately, many of her great roles were documented, and so we'll get a chance to hear them. Let's see. For this presentation, I'm going to look at the powerful influence of art. And actually, I was so lucky to have Anna present about intuition, because this is exactly how performers do their music. They don't focus on the mechanics. They just go into the flow and they let it spin. It's totally tuition connected to yourself and your own sense of the sound you're trying to make. This flow allows people to take daring chances while they're in this state, and they can just let the music go and spin and create this sound because they trust it so much out of that flow state. This was Beverly's gift to us. I didn't know what I was seeing in 1975 or 1977. I just knew there was something that she was teaching me by example of what I wanted to learn about music and how to be in the world as a stage director. So she showed me how to do that. I had the pleasure of working with her, being an assistant director on many operas that she did with Tito Capobianco in the San Diego Opera and New York City Opera. And so in addition to being Beverly's story, this is mine as well. For Beverly, the creative process was her key to healing. For somehow she knew that in the process of making art, we simply don't create a piece of art, we create ourselves. Here's her story. Like an opera, each artist's life is composed of stories, a collection of moments of longing and joy, tragedy and loss, missteps and accomplishments. And each story of every artist that touches our lives, this is the masterpiece of the human experience. We all exist in this joy together. My journey of remembering back to San Diego and the Merry Widow Opera of 1977 is such an experience of memories recovered. They're both bittersweet, they're wonderful, and I figured out that our dreams and memories are really changed as we look back 40 years later. We realize so many things that we didn't know in the moment. Her joy in singing was infectious, and her joy in living with everyone during that time made their lives come alive. One critic described it, I think, perfectly. Beverly Sills was the dazzling, irresistible embodiment of the total joy of singing. Let's look at a wonderful tribute to her life, a brief little clip from the Kennedy Center Honors in 1985. It was hosted by her dear friend, Carol Burnett. Whoops.
Ladies and gentlemen, Carol Burnett.
Good evening. When I was a kid, I loved all kinds of things. I loved music, I loved the stage, I loved comedy. I loved the whole kit and caboodle except opera. It was a forbidding world. I mean, all those unpronounceable names and unreachable notes and unbelievable stories. And then along came Bubbles, better known as Beverly Sills. And she made opera come alive with character, drama, and humor. And she taught a new audience to love an old art form, and along the way, we all fell in love with her. I first saw Beverly, I got really interested in her about 10 years ago when I watched her on 60 Minutes, and I thought, now there is a woman I would really like to get to know. So I called her up on the telephone, and I said, I'd really like to meet with you to discuss our doing a little two-person show. It was sort of a fantasy of mine. I had in mind something called Sills and Burnett at the Met. And, well, why not reach for the moon, I thought. And she said, well, what do we need a meeting for? When do you want to do the show? We did, and I had one of the best times I've ever had in my life. We really had a swell time, and although the one thing, she ticked me off. Just a little. I mean, I knew I couldn't sing quite as well as Beverly, but we happened to do a sketch on the show together, and she got more laughs than I did. However, in spite of that, we're still best buddies, and in truth, no one could sing like Beverly. And I don't know of anyone who has more fun doing it. And somewhere out there in Iowa or Tennessee or Oregon, there's a kid who's going to be a diva someday, because Beverly Sills has been the matchless diva of our day and generation. She wouldn't settle for being voted Brooklyn's most beautiful baby of 1932. By 9, she was showing her talent anywhere she could.
Rain so white, happy little wash they saw.
Underneath was a fierce determination to be a diva. But she refused to go to Europe. She would be the first to make it from the American stage. The first step was a touring opera company, traveling back roads in a series of grueling one-night stands. After 54 straight nights of La Traviata, she said, "My voice was fine, but my feet were killing me." She auditioned at the New York City Opera and was rejected 7 times. Great voice, they told her, no personality. The 8th time, she said, I made sure my personality showed. She became a regular and soon emerged as one of the company's most promising sopranos. Her career was blossoming. So was her life. She and husband Peter had 2 children. But discovering they had physical handicaps, she retired, saying, "I can't sing anymore. I have too many other things on my mind." But her zest for music was nurtured by her family's zest for life. Her sheer delight in singing was what she was ready to share with the world. It was New York City Opera's debut production at Lincoln Center. An electrified audience realized they were seeing more than a career reborn. The diva had arrived. She conquered the stages of the world, the greatest singing actress of our time, they said. At La Scala, they called her Il Fenomeno. Finally, she sang at the Metropolitan Opera. Beverly wasn't debuting with the Met. The Met was debuting with Beverly. She brought opera to a wider audience than any singer ever had before. She made us all fall in love with music and with life. In 1978, she said, "I want to put my voice to rest quietly and with pride." Today, as director of the New York City Opera, her fire and imagination inspire young American talent. She may have stopped singing, but the world will never stop listening. Pioneer, diva, made in America. Bravo, Beverly Sills.
That's her husband, Peter, behind her there. So how does someone like this become Beverly Sills, who set the world on fire and had everybody fall in love with her? Let's talk a little bit about early psychological underpinnings of how she became a very secure and proud person because of a wonderful family that supported her. She grew up, as you see, with the security of knowing she would be a singer. She was very close to her 2 older brothers and her parents. They called her Bubbly, not Bubbles, but Bubbly. And she thought that meant that was what her personality was supposed to be like, so of course she played along. In her autobiography, she tells us, "My mother put a premium on being cheerful." And we saw this in her every day because she loved coloratura sopranos and she had a great singing voice herself. We had Gallicurci and Lily Pond's records in our kitchen and our Victrola was going all the time. And so I sang along with it all too. My mother was pretty sure that she had a talented child. So at age 4, she took me to audition for Uncle Bob's Rainbow House. That was when I got my stage name, Beverly Sills. Belle Silverman didn't seem fancy enough, so they gave her a new name. She sang on the show every week until she was 7, selections from French and Italian operas. She tells us, Mama and I spent every Saturday together, and we went into Manhattan to buy records. I'd memorized the 22 arias on the Galli-Curci recordings, and I could hit all the high notes. My mother was happy that her daughter shared the lifelong love of opera. And so we went on to the next one, Major Beau's Capital Family Hour, and Beverly sang on this program until she was 10. Her goal was to earn enough money to buy a concert grand piano. She wanted a Steinway in the living room. Well, her dad told her that everything else would have to get moved out if she was indeed able to get a Steinway piano. Beverly went to Major Beau's and said, I need a raise. Age 10, right? And he said, well, what do you need the money for, Beverly? What are you going to use it for? And she said, I need a real piano so I can hear the sounds properly. The upright piano doesn't make the proper sounds. Her ear was so finely tuned that she actually was asking her parents to have their upright tuned like every day because it would go out so fast that she couldn't stand it. So the perfect pitch that she has, of course, is the answer for that. The other thing that Major Beau's did for her is he recommended that she start singing lessons and talk to her mom about that. And they found a very famous singer, teacher, by the name of Estelle Liebling. You might know the name if you're fond of opera. She was Beverly's teacher for 34 years. So let's review some of the theories that we know are important to Beverly's success as a singer. We know how secure attachments in childhood set us up for having secure attachment patterns in adulthood. These people that have these secure attachments indeed have a very positive outlook of life, positive view of themselves and of the world. And the attachment has to have a good quality to it. It can't just be once in a while or every other day. It has to be pretty ongoing. And this secure bond that the child has with the parent, I guess they had a pretty good one because they sang together every day, so opera was the thing. We've seen how this formative relationship with Beverly and her mother was very joyful for both of them. This occasion for joy was shared daily in the kitchen, I guess over scrambled eggs or whatever else was happening. Can you imagine Galli-Curci over breakfast? Oh my God. Winnicott tells us that the concept of the true self describes this spontaneous, authentic experience, that one knows deeply who they are inside themselves. And out of this, the child creates a sense of life that's actually worth living. And if responded to by the mother, then this sets up the continuing development of that true self. Dan Stern tells us that intersubjectivity is complementary to attachment, where attachment and intersubjectivity are separate systems but parallel in the development of the person that flows from childhood into adulthood. This attachment intersubjectivity relationship is very important to attain the richness of the relationship and then the bond that goes on from that. Suzanne Langer tells us how art changes us. We didn't know about this when she was first writing about it, but we see now, looking at Costandi from Boston, he wrote a book on neuroplasticity last year, and it shows us how brains of artists are typically different with neuroimaging scans, and how the passions that are evoked by music actually show up in the brain as changes in how they're processed. They're processed differently than words. And so we see now how this evolution, standing on neuroscience, really helps us understand. She tells us that moods in music change the intersubjective field because emotions and moods and passions we did not know before become aware to us in our experience. Let's consider how music was in fact the medicine that healed Beverly through excerpts I'll read to you from her autobiography. When our daughter Muffy was 2 years old, we discovered she had a profound loss of hearing, and shortly thereafter, our 2-month-old son Bucky was diagnosed as severely mentally retarded. She tells us, Peter was a stoic. He believed, whatever happens, you continue with your life. I'm not a stoic at all. I was overwhelmed by the children's handicaps. My behavior changed. I would not leave the house. I stayed home and got domestic. I took care of our children. My mother and brothers telephoned every day. A lot of well-meaning friends called, and they all seemed to say the same thing. I can't believe that you, of all people, would have a deaf child. That's not what I wanted to hear. I didn't know what I wanted to hear. I stopped flying to New York City to see my mother. I stopped flying to New York City to see Miss Liebling and study singing. I canceled my life. So, my mother started flying up to Boston. She was my tower of strength. I was terribly depressed to learn about Muffy's deafness. And when I learned about Bucky's disabilities, I was crushed. There's no way of my describing to you my initial desolation. How could this have happened to my children? I went into shock. Peter did his very best to cheer me up. He invented something that he called Adult Day. On Saturdays, we'd do whatever he had planned for us, ending up with dinner out, going to the theater or a movie. It helped, but it wasn't enough. Sarah Caldwell, who had become my good friend, started talking to me about, let's go back in and do an opera you really want to do. You pick it, and we'll go put it on the stage. Now, you know Sarah Caldwell in Boston, she put operas on with 3 sheets and a can of paint. And Beverly was willing to do anything to kind of start again. So they did Manon, and it was an exquisite production. The Boston Symphony Orchestra was in the pit, and it surprised and shocked Beverly out of her depression. She said it was very important, the audience reaction that she got. I had not provoked such enthusiasm anywhere before. I realized how much I needed opera now as a refuge from my personal problems. Yet Beverly still had to be gently coached back to singing and her rightful place at the New York City Opera. She recalls, I was still deeply depressed and despondent, but my doctor told Peter to make it happen. So Peter did. On my 33rd birthday, he gave me 52 round-trip tickets on the Boston-New York shuttle. I was to go, and he told me I had to spend them all. I was to go to New York once a week, have my singing lesson with Miss Liebling, and see my mother. It was the best present he could have given me. It was the kind of therapy necessary to force me out of the house and make me begin thinking about something besides my family problems. From then on, whenever I was scheduled to sing, I couldn't wait to get to the theater. I think that was the beginning of my split personality. I suddenly felt, when I was walking into the theater, that I was no longer Beverly Sills, but the lady I was about to portray. For 3 hours a night, I forgot my own troubles and I concentrated on hers. It was great. It was a great source of escape. That's what opera had become to me. I couldn't wait to get to the theater and to become somebody else. As this therapy continued, Beverly realized that at age 34, she had become more mature than she ever thought possible. She tells us, "In a strange way, my children had brought me an inner peace. The first question I asked myself when I learned of their tragedies was a self-pitying why me? Then gradually it changed to much more important. Despite their handicaps, they were showing an enormous state of living their lives and enjoying their lives. I had happy, cheerful children. They just didn't know that this wasn't life, so I had to make it happen for them." After this had happened, Peter and I felt that we could survive anything. Recent neuroscience has showed us that the adult brain is, in fact, very malleable, and it changes throughout life in reaction to everything that we experienced. The old version of brains are fixed is no longer a scientific fact. Our nervous system adapts to our unique realities, and we literally do remake our brains daily. Neuroimaging studies of creative artists have actually shown that the creative brain differs from the typical brain. These studies come out of Nancy Andreessen's wonderful work with writers at the Iowa Workshop. She also went to the New York Philharmonic and she started grabbing the guys in the first chairs and the women in the cello section. She had some singers come in and actually I think they volunteered for her study, but I think they didn't have a lot of choice. She came and got them and said, "I need you guys to do this for me." And what they found was extraordinary in the brains of performing artists when they looked at these neuroimaging studies. They saw that in over 30 studies, there was increased gray matter in performing artists. This defines, of course, we know muscle control, particularly sequencing in language, which is important for singers in Broca's area of the brain. There was an enlarged cerebellum. In a high percentage, it was 79% of the sample of 30 studies, really high, that showed that the enlarged cerebellum and more highly developed visual spatial abilities were characteristic of performing artists. And a larger hippocampus accounts for the fact that people can memorize as much as they need to memorize when they're performing. Neurons that fire simultaneously, we do know that they make stronger connections and do allow us to rewire our brains. This phenomena of this plasticity, it comes through sustained cognitive tasks, that if you do it repeatedly, day in and day out, and day in and day out, that's why the rehearsal process for training oneself to be an extraordinary artist is so important, because it's with that sustained cognitive task that the brain actually changes. Standing on this foundation, then, of neuroscience provides a solid platform to evolve a practice for me and others, as art is the medicine that can heal your life. Through her music, Beverly was able to cope with the emotional upheaval that her children had wrought on her and returned to the operatic stage to become one of the most beloved singers of our time. We see how she focused on singing. She sang every day, first of all, in the kitchen in Brooklyn, then on the stages of the international opera theaters. And she used this singing as this sustained cognitive task to improve her art and make her into this person that she was. Let's look at how she thought about flow. Beverly called flow glow because she didn't know what it was. We didn't have Csikszentmihalyi around then telling us about flow and creativity. So we know the outcome of her story, which has given us this extraordinary example. I'd like to read a bit from my journal here. Beverly had that magic quality. Her presence on stage radiated joy. She said she could feel the glow that caught her up and swept her away and gathered her audience up to come along with her. She says, "I can't tell you what a good time I have on stage. Everything sparkles and I glow. I love being able to sing well, to have it just pour out of me. I'm finally happy on stage. I'm greedy for those 3 hours. They're hours of pure joy." And for her colleagues as well, bass baritone Robert Hale tells us, being on stage with Beverly, her powerful radiance, such strength of character, and presence of moment and action that absolutely encompassed all of us. Everyone on the stage was caught up in the moment because of her great involvement and her power to portray. She had that exceptional magic quality. She just raised the level of any performance she was in. She raised the level of everyone. I have a fun clip for you, a rehearsal video from I Puritani back to 1975. And you can see how Beverly enjoyed lightening the mood during rehearsals with little jokes and many smiles. The best of all, the joy in her singing, and of course her frequent and legendary infectious laugh. So you can imagine what happens when you're in the audience and something like that is going on stage. You have that bond with the audience. This was the basis of her magic. There was something that crossed the footlights, this exceptional something that we didn't know what it was, but it was something that everybody talked about. This bond with her audience had to be the basis of her magic. From the moment she came on stage, she took everybody on a memorable journey, and she made them feel actually that they were the occasion for her joy. It was everything to Beverly to communicate to the audience, to feel the affirmation of that human connection, and to touch those for whom she sang. Remember, her daughter never heard her sing. Never. So she had to reach out in some other way to have that touch of someone actually responding to that gorgeous sound that came out of her mouth and her soul. Beverly's need for the extraordinary and her extraordinary ability to connect formed the basis of the magic in Sills' performance. We've seen how Beverly could experience joy while in this flow state, and her audience naturally became part of what we call an intersubjective field that encompasses everyone present. She invited her audience to come along and live inside her art with her and bask in the magic of what was happening on the stage. Music critics commented that her singing had tremendously positive effect on her audience. It took their collective breath away. While being absorbed in the flow state, Csikszentmihalyi tells us that only the now matters, not a second before or a second after, as the artist becomes one with the activity, and the performance flows as if it's automatic. Without doubt, the scene goes forward as if by magic. Csikszentmihalyi's word, not mine. It kind of works, huh? While being in these flow states, it's interesting that neuroimaging studies also tell us that the brain is more efficient. It works a lot faster. The details are perfectly articulated in the brain, and the brain itself knows exactly where it's going without thinking. The key to enjoying the flow state actually knows how to properly gauge the risk that's involved for you during the performance. Although, as I said, we didn't have the flow concept when Beverly was with us doing her performing in the 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, when she was at her peak, she described this working metaphor for herself as her experience of the glow on stage. From my journals, I described a working session that we had at San Diego Opera during The Merry Widow, and she described one time over lunch how she'd let go and let her singing just carry her forward into the glow. We laughed a little about that particular brand of bravery because we didn't know what we were talking about. But her direction for herself was very clear. She didn't focus on the mechanics of singing. Open the throat, don't swallow the vowels, don't say the T's, forget that it's an E flat. Oh, by the way, forget that it's an E flat. So she didn't focus on any of those mechanics. She just let herself go into the glow. To achieve the brilliance, she thought, it emerged from her just letting it go, focusing on the sound, and trusting it to spin forward and carry her ahead with what she was doing. These experiences, I figured out later, were what I call her healing medicine. This joy that allowed her to be on the stage let her do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. Interestingly, going back and making the analysis, singing was life-giving for her, and I suggest that she could not have lived without it, and we would not have had her in our lives without it. I want to give a really nice shout out to my colleague Nancy Guy, who wrote an extraordinary book following Beverly's death called The Magic of Beverly Sills. I'd like to thank her for the inspiration for this little excerpt on flow. I added them to my comments, but thinking about the whole book of living inside your art and your music while in a flow state, it's a new technique that I've working very hard with in my work with performing artists today, of what are the things that you do to make that happen. Beverly's experiences were not unique. Other people were doing them. They just didn't know what they were doing. I'd like to look next at the opera that brought her her greatest success. It launched her into stardom. Some of the most beautiful singing that people say she ever did was in 1966. Unfortunately, we don't have any video of this performance of Julius Caesar at the New York City Opera, but we do have some soundtracks that I can share with you. Norman Traegle and Beverly Sills as Cleopatra, and Julius Caesar. Interestingly, Julius Caesar is not very well known, but it's considered among Handel's greatest works in any genre, and perhaps it's the greatest role because of the person of Cleopatra, for whom Handel created a very vividly drawn, characteristic, and very difficult music. Beverly made this role her own. She somehow embodied the very soul of Cleopatra, and the audience responded to her with astonishing ovations, ensuring her success for the future. The aria is Se pietà di me non senti, and I have for you the translation up on the screen. I want you to particularly listen to the words, io morirò, I will die. She tells us in the text throughout the aria that she's dying, and she models that she's dying throughout this aria. You can feel it and see it. It's very palpable. Julius Caesar, musically, is an extended meditation on grief. Much of the music is deeply doleful, addressing various states of emotional devastation. The key is F-sharp minor, which for Handel denoted the key of tragedy. This opera is in F-sharp minor, and every time Beverly shows up as Cleopatra, we hear this introduction into F-sharp minor, which again signals us that we are moving into a tragic personality. It's likely that these arias, so masterly performed by Beverly, reflected her inner struggles and allowed her some cathartic release from her sadness. Beverly describes Se pietà. Sometimes there are pieces of music which from the very first time you hear them, touch your soul in a way that holds you trapped in the flow of the music from beginning to end. Beverly describes her opening night performance. At the end of the second act, Cleopatra sings a long, difficult aria. I decided I would use a technique called fil de voce, filigree for us, spinning that sound and spinning it and spinning it. It's a very risky thing to do because you have to sing very high in your head voice and very soft for a long period of time, which takes a lot of breath control and tremendous techniques. You have to sing the aria as if you're not breathing. The audience must not be aware that you're taking time out to breathe. When I began, an absolute hush came over the audience. People were hanging on every note. I think it was the single most extraordinary piece of singing I ever did. I know that I had never heard myself sing that way before. When I finished, I saw Gigi in the wings. She was weeping uncontrollably. The curtain came down very slowly, and then a strange thing happened. There was a death-like silence in the audience. And eventually a roar went through the house, the likes which I had never heard. I was a little stunned by it. The audience would not stop applauding. They just sat there applauding and applauding and applauding as if it was the end of the opera. I just knew I had never performed that way before. Once during the rehearsals for the opera, Julius Rudel, our conductor, said to me in awe, "Where did you learn how to sing like that?" An interesting question. My voice had not changed at all. I guess I had. Now, instead of using my voice to build a career, I was singing for peer pressure, pure pleasure, I was not singing because I wanted to be Beverly Sills superstar, but because I needed to sing to live, desperately. My voice poured out more easily because I was no longer singing for someone's approval. I was beyond caring about the public's reaction. I wanted to enjoy myself and live my life. At the same time, I'd found a kind of serenity and a new maturity as a result of my children's problems. It seemed no longer important whether anybody loved me or not. More important was for me now to love them. Feeling that way turns your whole life around. Living becomes an act of giving. When I do a performance now, I still like the adulation of the audience, of course, but my real satisfaction comes from what I have given of myself, the joyful act of singing. I can't give much of an explanation for the way I sang in Julius Caesar that night, and for the way the audience, sensing my own joy, responded. The role of Cleopatra was tailor-made for me. Vocally, there were no hurdles that I couldn't handle, and I knew it. I went home totally happy. There was no question that Julius Caesar was going to change my life. And this was actually true. With a single stunning performance, Beverly established herself as the reigning prima donna of the New York City Opera. A cherished place she held until her retirement 14 years later. Her success was glorious. She went to the Opera House the day after the premiere, and her mailbox was so stuffed that there was a rope leading into the stage manager's office, leading her to pick up the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of messages that were in about 30 baskets for her, and she just sat down and cried right on the spot. She tells us, "I never expected to have a career of such enormous proportions. While it was happening, and even at the height of my career, all the attention I attracted was hard to believe. I loved performing, and I never lost or questioned it. When I worked on Julius Caesar, I became Cleopatra. That was the first time I lost my own identity while being on stage, and realized I could become any character I played. It was a joyous, healing experience for me." The human soul is so resilient. My son's handicaps were very difficult to see. A few months after my appearance in Julius Caesar, it became clear that we weren't doing Bucky a favor by keeping him home. He cannot speak at all. My son was very isolated and alone. Since he was diagnosed as autistic, he rarely had anyone his own age to play with. His frustration was so great that he had become dangerously self-abusive. When he was 6 years old, Peter and I had to finally decide that we needed to send him away to a special school. Peter and I knew that he was leaving home and us forever. At the end of her autobiography, she reminisced, "I knew that my career wasn't a fluke. I was a very good singer and musician, and when I was at the top of the heap, I produced. But I can't finally analyze what I did or why people liked what I did. It all fits into that category of unnameable magic." Opera has been a soundtrack for me all of my life since I was a very young child, and a touchstone for positive, pleasurable experience that helped me transcend the dailiness of my life through engaging with music and singing. My grandmother was an opera singer, and she could simply delight me by fashioning an aria from simple directions on how to set a table. When I was at her house, there was a lot of singing going on, and she'd get done telling me how to do something, and I'd say something back to her, like I said, "Oh, well, how do you do this?" And she'd looked at me and she said, "Well, what key are you going to sing that in?" She'd send me to the piano and she'd say, "How about G major? Show me which notes those are," and I'd make a chord, and she'd go, "Okay, the knife goes on the," and I'd say, "Right." "The fork goes on the left." And this would go on, and of course my grandfather and my parents were looking at her like, "Oh, God, when are we going to get to have dinner?" I went to high school and college in Los Angeles in the late 60s and early 70s, and I was studying voice and stage directing at the time. Los Angeles didn't have its own opera company back then, and so when the New York City came to town, as it did every year, Beverly sang what were to become her signature roles: Violetta, Manon, Baby Doe, Cleopatra, the Three Tudor Queens, and of course the Mad Lucia. Those shows were must-see events, and everybody turned out for it. Everybody turned out for it. I was awestruck by the ease in which she flew through the terrifying coloratura passages, and by the sheer joy and warmth of her acting. How could you not fall in love with opera? I did. For me, as I look back, those times seemed to be opera business as usual. I mean, that was what it was, right? Now I know that it was opera at its most extraordinary. Think back, Beverly Sills on the stage with Placido Domingo and Cheryl Milnes in all of these wonderful, wonderful roles when they were all babies, and they were in their 30s. They didn't know about all of this, but they just sang so gloriously together. Of course, I went backstage to meet Beverly. I was very brave. She had, of course, become my idol, and I wanted to meet her and talk to her. And I was so surprised when she complied. She was actually interested in knowing about me. Eventually, she invited me to come and work for her. I did. Let's look now at a very happy production in San Diego, 1977, The Merry Widow. Stage director Tito Capobianco finally got his own home, and he got to move from New York City Opera to San Diego as general director. I was delighted to be hired right away to work on the production team for several operas with Beverly, Tito, and Gigi. These are some pictures of the production, and this is Gigi doing Beverly's hair, which she did all the time. And there was no warming up in Beverly's dressing room. They were ordering in food, they were talking about their kids, they were talking about the bridge game that was happening in the wings on stage left, and the second table was being set up because there was a very long interval and more people wanted to get in on the bridge games. Beverly was notorious for doing crossword puzzles in ink backstage in between her entrances in order to sort of, just set it to a very friendly family atmosphere backstage. Beverly did attribute much of her success to Tito. He's the handsome guy on the left, the stage director from Argentina. His wife, Gigi, was a prima ballerina in the Argentina Ballet for many, many years. And so she was in charge of directing all of the movement that happened on stage. The guys did not particularly love coming to ballet practice, but it was required when you worked at this particular opera house. And then after the guys came to do their ballet at the opera house, the production staff and everybody else on the production team ended up going to ballet also, because Gigi said we needed to be able to move like lynx backstage. Nobody could hear us moving. And she actually had people in socks with masking tape on the bottom of the socks walking around this stage so you'd stick just a little bit, but there was no shoe noise of the heel-toe movement of the foot. Eventually it was better, I guess, because those slipper socks came in and they got sticky stuff on the bottom of them. So anyway, these particular shows by Tito and Gigi were living examples of how the roles in opera, Beverly did this. She did it, and she taught everybody else what she learned. She was a very generous colleague. She says, "I never lost my appreciation of the way Tito directed me. It was very important to me to keep refining my roles because it meant I was still creating instead of simply repeating." Let's look at how The Merry Widow changed everybody who worked on it. Such a joyful, this is Hannah's entrance in Act 1, a little clip so you can see the joy on the stage. Whoop, what happened? So the way that the joy that happens on stage, it happened off stage before everybody came on stage. There was dancing going on backstage, and the stage managers had to stand like this to keep people from waltzing onto the stage. But it was the way Beverly wanted to wake everybody up so that that energy would really be there for when they made their entrance. Let's look at a little clip from Act 2, the famous Velia aria with the chorus. Beverly has a way of just taking the stage, and no matter how many people are on stage with her, she's the focus of attention. Beverly loved the business of opera making, and because she did, we all fell in love with the creative process with her. Rehearsals were occasions of respect, curiosity, and celebration for getting closer to the desired result. Beverly's presence always set the tone for concentrated devotion to the music at hand, yet full of enthusiasm for coming together in the creative endeavor. We were on her team, and what leadership! She taught by example, not by command. She was an extraordinarily generous colleague. The theater was her home, and she was very comfortable there, as anyone you might imagine. But more, she welcomed us there to belong together as a family, so it became our home as well. We visited in the dressing rooms hours before performances with last-minute questions. Gigi was always there, doing Beverly's hair, makeup, considering adjustments to costumes, last-minute blocking changes. In between scenes, Beverly would pull up a chair to watch the action. Beverly talked about the struggles of being a well-known singer. She said, "The psychological side of stardom is amazingly difficult. If you have the support of your family, it's a stabilizing force that can bring you back down to earth. There's no avoiding the pressure. I may have handled it all with humor, but that doesn't mean I didn't feel the pressure. Believe me, I did." She lived the truth of her art through the characters she brought to life and on the stage, and her music healed her through her deep engagement with this process of art making. As a tribute to Beverly following her death, Tito and Gigi Capobianco wrote that she created singing, acting interpretations that were endless magic, human and visceral. Beverly's hypnotizing performance can only be compared to the greatest in the history of opera. So you all remember with love and affection the Merry Widow waltz. I'll close there with the third act of Merry Widow.
What is it?
I forbid you to marry Monsieur de Rossillon.
Do you?
Yes, and so does the fatherland.
Oh, the fatherland. I see. Well, you may assure His Majesty that I had no intention of marrying Monsieur de Rossillon.
What? But the engagement, the rendezvous, the pavilion...
It was not my rendezvous. It was another woman. A married woman. To save her marriage, I took her place, that's all.
That's all? Why didn't you tell me this before?
Why should I?
You can't guess.
No. I want to hear you say it.
I can't say it. Can you say it?
Not before you.
Beverly once told me, everything you need you already have. You're complete right now. You are a whole person, not an apprentice person on the way to someplace else. Your completeness must be understood by you just as you are right now. We know how explorers rely on the North Star to find their way when there are no other landmarks. Singing was Beverly's North Star, the ultimate realization for her potential of fulfillment and happiness. Yep, that's me. 1977. In my work these days, I'm seeking ways to engage the healing energy that exists within the process of art making to help artists heal and be as successful on stage as they possibly can, and further apply all of these ideas that art itself can become the very music that heals. And the medicine that we need to heal ourselves to create the balance of living life, it's as abundant as our own imagination. There are special people who come into our lives for a time and leave an incredible and indelible mark that forever change us. My relationship with Beverly was that gift. To this day, her legacy lives on through me and through the many others whose lives she touched. And the last line from Baby Doe, always and forever. Thank you.